Welcome, Mrs. Kalniete. You are leading Parliament's work on disinformation and foreign interference on European democracy. I wanted to focus today more on the disinformation part of your work. You have already prepared 2 sets of recommendations for the European Union on how to deal with this matter. And I understand that in this process, you met with many independent journalists, legislators from foreign countries, UN representatives. What did you learn from these meetings? Is there a pattern or specific challenges in Europe when it comes to disinformation?
We have learned a lot from them, but the general observation what I can make is not very optimistic, because the speed with which the digital reality develops is so high that the legislative process is lagging behind.
Because technology goes faster than the
Yes.
legislative process.
As one of the experts said, the situation what we are discussing currently today, it's already yesterday. So,
And we cannot preempt what's going to happen.
Absolutely. And secondly, what is very difficult for democratic countries, and we are democratic countries, that we are very open in our system, and those third countries who have malign interests, they are manipulating with our freedoms to intervene with our freedom.
We can still learn from the past, and we've seen in America that disinformation has helped to fuel in violence. I still remember the scenes of people storming the Capitol in the United States, and a year after, people storming the Congress in Brazil as well. Do you see a risk that this sort of violence happens also in Europe?
First of all, I have to say that I'm quite optimistic about Europe in that sense, because if we are speaking about unbelievable events in the US Congress or in Brazil, that was the consequence of quite long time spread of different harmful information which raise the tension in society and divides the society. And there's part of that lies with the President of the United States. I should say that in Europe, maybe that because of the Union, we are trained more to be inclined for compromise culture. And our politicians are more responsible. I can't name any politician who would appeal to nation just attack the parliament. But also why I'm so optimistic, that we really understand the challenge of the problem, and we are trying to adopt the legislation. We have a Digital Service Act, which is dealing with illegal content, and which puts also the responsibility for platforms to assess the risks and also to control the content which is distributed in the social networks. And secondly, we strengthened the first attempt to propose for the platforms a sort of agreement of behavior which is called Democracy Defense Package. The first attempt was called Code of Conduct, but it's not flawless because it's voluntarily. The biggest platforms all agreed and they are trying to implement, but there are a multitude of small servers and platforms who are not part of that agreement, and some of them are quite aggressive. So we have to find a way how also impose on them this behavior.
In the 2 reports that you prepare for this parliament, you mentioned that social network platforms are not doing their part, are not doing enough. And I want to highlight that your 2 reports, one was last year and the other one just been adopted this week. Does it mean that in 12 months nothing has evolved, nothing has happened to improve?
That is a question about strengthening of toolboxes, what we already are having. And the most important is that we have to get to understand how the algorithms are working, that they have to be more transparent. There has to be accessibility for researchers and also for fact checkers. Social networks, I think the most important tools which Parliament already adopted is Digital Service Act, because it's dealing with illegal content and imposing to social platforms certain obligations they have to follow.
And one of our recommendations is that the actions to counter disinformation should go hand in hand with actions to promote free speech and other fundamental rights. This might seem contradictory. Could you explain to us how fighting against disinformation helps promoting free speech and vice versa?
Sounds quite contradictory, but this is something what I understand profoundly by all my experience. Why we need to counter disinformation? Because disinformation appeals to psychologically to human beings by serving on menu what he wants to hear. And then he bases his decisions and understanding of reality on this bubble in which he is included because of likes he is making, and that is the job done by algorithms. Why we need to promote truly free speech and information? Because that information is based on facts. And by providing the truthful picture of any of problems, we are providing freedom of speech, freedom of information.
What you mentioned about algorithms make me think of one thing. There are some psychological studies that say that people tend to believe what they want to believe, actually. Yes. And I guess that people and institutions interested in sowing disinformation, they operate over that, they take profit of that. How can we face this problem?
This problem is as old, as ancient as humanity.
Very human nature.
Yeah, that's really very human nature. And the difference between disinformation a few centuries ago and disinformation currently is exactly the quantity of disinformation, the instruments with which it could be dispersed around the world, and the speed with which it's distributed. But as I mentioned, exactly because there is micro-targeted disinformation. For instance, 2016 campaign of President Trump was precisely built on that. And that is the year when also the democratic countries, we realized the danger of that intervention and interference in democratic processes. But the only way of how we can help to build resilience, I think it goes through education. And here again, we are facing a problem. We can recommend and suggest, but a system of education is entirely in the responsibility of member states.
And are they doing enough on media literacy?
There are quite many different programs and projects to help to deal with media literacy, but I still think that we need more systematic approach and to allocate more financial resources for that, because media literacy still have loopholes as to very young people and also to the senior citizens who are out of these programs and tools. They are not so skillful to deal with them. My conviction, if we speak generally about all this enormous complex, is that that is a mistake, that we are dealing with digital revolution in the compartments. I think the basic problem that we don't have complex approach to that. And if I'm looking in the future, I think that we are facing a complete change of reality with artificial intelligence, and which will require the change of practically everything.
And then there is also the question of definition. Like, who decides what is disinformation, what is true, and what is a lie? You have asked in your reports for the EU to step up action to come up with an international common definition of disinformation, like some countries have for hate crimes or for racism. Why is this important, to have a common definition of disinformation?
You have to have common language. You have to know what that word contains. But this is extremely difficult task to find a common definition for disinformation. I went to UN with the delegation of our committee, and we discussed it in different departments and also with different representatives from different member states of United Nations, and it just showed what are the difficulties for countries with in the European Union. It's quite easy.
Values.
Yeah, we have the set of values, but these values are not values for entire community of United Nations. There are also countries in which democracy is, let's call it controlled democracy, which is a sort of manipulation of the elections. Then there are autocracies and there are also dictatorships. And for them, disinformation is an ideological tool to assure the control over the country. And that's why European Union has to take lead in that and at least agree on the term of disinformation among ourselves. On several other difficult problems we have been the setters of language, the setters of terminology, the setters of trend, and then gradually it is adopted by other institutions.
On your report, you also introduced the concept of a high-risk third country. What is this about, and which countries are you talking about?
All our relationship with the world outside from European Union is based on the country-agnostic approach, which means that we are treating all countries equally. But in the same time, when we know that all those countries are not equal if we are looking from the point of different objective criteria. And high-risk third countries, I am proposing that we treat them according to objective criteria, which could be, and I will read them, for instance, what could be potential criteria. It could be activity of foreign interference, which is fact-checked and as evidence, stealing of intellectual property, systematic stealing of intellectual property from Union and its member states. One of criteria for me, which is important, consistent violation of human rights in the country. For instance, in the case of Russia, the blatant revision of international order by act of aggression.
So you mentioned Russia, China. Are there other countries that we can mention already?
There are. We can speak about Iran. Practically, there are a multitude of countries, but none of them can achieve such a volume of interference and diversity of interference as Russia and China.
So those are the main ones.
Yeah.
Coming back to the European elections, we are 1 year away from the European elections. In your report, you also mentioned that Russia is massively investing on financing political parties in democratic countries. How can this affect the information scenario in Europe?
You are touching one of the issues which are absolutely vital for the existence of our democracy, because democracy is an open system. As soon as there is a hostile third country coming in with its own interests, financing so-called governmental, non-governmental organizations or proxy foundations, which are used to strengthen their interests, which are used to divide our societies, then we have to protect ourselves. I think one of the most important parts of elections is to strengthen the electoral instruments, which is the voting system, the counting of votes, etc. Secondly, it's Media Freedom Pact, which provides independence for media, which is protected against manipulative media, which supports investigative journalism, because investigative journalists are those who can follow that dirty money, how it is in a very covert way seeping into the union and complicating the normal democratic process. Of course, also, as we were speaking about media literacy, about fact-checking, about the resilience against manipulation and fake news, all that is important.
You also alerted that Russia and perhaps other countries are likely to step up their misleading narratives against Europe in the wake of the elections to try and influence the European elections from next year. And there's some media reports that Russia has tripled the investment, the budget for propaganda about the Ukrainian war. And that part of this money and this propaganda are also to be spread in other countries, not only internally in Russia. How can Europe oppose this warfare, this communication warfare?
First steps were very speedy. We closed Sputnik and Russia Today. These were broadcasting in many countries and in many languages. And that was, I would say, a very strong signal to Russia that we are not going to accept that sort of disinformation instrument in the European Union. The problem is that Russia Today, Sputnik and other media, they immediately switched to the areas where we have no power to forbid, to social media networks.
So people could still go around?
Yeah, Telegram and TikTok and Facebook, whatever. That is one of the problems. We also have to replace with proactive content, which is attractive and interesting for those who are the consumers, who have been consumers of Russia Today and Sputnik. And this is something what we are trying currently to do.
And to conclude this interview, we're having this conversation here in the House of European History, which is a museum managed by the European Parliament here in Brussels. What is history's role on disinformation? Does it help countering disinformation or does it help promoting it? How do you see it?
I would say that for years and years, we were quite indifferent to the historical truth and to historical justice. And it created a very beneficial platform for Kremlin, for Putin, to manipulate with historical facts, to introduce their own interpretations of them. And look where we are now, because Kremlin justifies their attack, aggressive attack, non-provoked attack to Ukraine with complete historical manipulation of facts stating that Ukraine never has been an independent country, that it is not a nation. And it shows how important it is that we are scrupulous when we are dealing with history and historical facts. For instance, deportations. I'm born in Siberia by deported parents, and in this museum I presented as a gift a letter of my grandfather from Gulag. I would say until the entrance of our countries in the European Union, communism and the crimes of communism were not really on the agenda of Western countries. But for instance, next month in the European Parliament, we will have for the first time the official commemoration ceremony for deportations of 1941. Now we are 30 years after the Iron Curtain fell. First time that ceremony will happen. Why I'm speaking about it? Because from the occupied territories of Ukraine, there are more than 20,000 children deported. Russian Duma adopted a law which allows urgent adoption of Ukrainian children. They are deprived of their national identity. They are converted into someone or they are not. And it just shows that history repeats itself if we do not strictly stand for truth. We accept silence, but because this is more comfortable, then it's very easy to repeat it again.